All right. So, okie dokie. So, hello, my name is Casey Kimbro. I am an undergraduate student here at Cal Poly Humboldt University, and my research critique is on an article titled COVID-19 and its impact on student-athlete depression and anxiety, the return to campus. So, a little bit about this study, background info. We all know COVID-19 has impacted everyone, not just student athletes, but the entire world's population. So we all know when in January 2020, when this thing was announced, school was online. People started working from home. Everyone from K through 12 students and university students were now living at home. People are working from home. Everyone has to wear masks. We tried to limit our travel everywhere we went. And life as we knew it just kind of flipped upside down. And it's been strange when it started, and it's still strange now. On top of it all, if you're a student athlete, you had your season cut abruptly short with no warning. And we all know that student athletes are kind of a unique population, and they have their own unique mental health needs. There have been studies that show that student athletes have higher levels of depression and anxiety than their non-athlete peers under regular circumstances. But if you add a world pandemic on top of that, you'll see mental health problems just go through the roof. So the purpose of this study was to examine student athlete mental health before and during this pandemic, especially with the added in element of having your season cut short. So this study mentioned that there's currently no research to examine exactly what I just mentioned in terms of student athlete mental health and mid-season cancellation. So this study kind of took a deep dive and did some evals on student athletes right as COVID was announced. And then as soon as they returned to campus, they did another eval to see where they were at. So the design of this study was very simple, very straightforward, completely uncomplicated. The student athletes completed the Beck Depression Inventory, the Athlete Identity Measurement Scale, and the Generalized Anxiety Disorder 7-item tests. And then they answered some free response questions at the end. Essentially, unfortunately, the AIMS questionnaire result, the Athlete Identity Measurement Scale, the results from that were skewed, and so they weren't usable. The biggest findings that this study found was the NCAA Spring 2020 Wellbeing Survey indicated that 9% of female student athletes, 7% of male student athletes felt so depressed it was difficult to function during this time. They also found that 27% of the female student athletes and 14% of the male student athletes felt overwhelming anxiety. More background or demographic information about these athletes that were evaluated. There was 178 of them total. Some of them didn't answer all the questions, so their data was not usable and not included. 59% of these student athletes came from Division I schools, 24.2% came from D2s, nearly 17% didn't answer this question at all, so that wasn't included. This study was disproportionately female student athletes. Most of them were 18 to 21 years old at the time of the study. The rest of them were 22 to 30, but about 68.3% were 18 to 21 years old at the time of this study. So taking a deep dive into the Beck Depression Inventory, out of the student athletes that answered questions and whose data was usable, there was 146 total people whose data was used on this test. And this was all, it's important to note, all responses were recorded upon the return to campus in fall 2020. So there's been a little bit of time since COVID was announced. The way that this test was scored, they gave you a score of 0 to 3. And based on the questions that you answered, if you got a score anywhere from 0 to 13, you got a score of 0, which indicated minimal depression. If you went anywhere from 14 to 19, that indicated mild to moderate depression. 20 to 28 gave you a 2 for definitely moderate depression. And then if you got 29 to 63, that indicated that you had severe depression. Here's the table that was provided directly in the study. You can see the percentages here that were associated with student athletes had minimal versus mild to moderate to severe depression. The main trend in this graph is noticing that most student athletes identified with minimal to mild depression. And it's also important to note that this data was taken again during COVID. So these numbers are elevated for sure. Like there's always going to be student athlete depression in under normal circumstances, but this is during a pandemic. So these numbers are definitely elevated. But most student athletes had minimal or mild depression. Some had moderate to severe, but it was mostly in the mild moderate category or mild minimal category. So now looking at the anxiety test, out of the usable data or numbers that we had 142 of these student athletes that completed this test whose data was usable. No respondents indicated that they had no anxiety. I think that's significant because student athletes are chronically anxious based on the responsibilities placed on them, the amount of timing in terms of practice, the balance of being a student, being an athlete, getting your nutrition right, getting your sleep right. There's a lot going on. So student athletes are definitely struggling with anxiety. You add in a pandemic on top of that, and anxiety will be higher naturally. Same timeline, all the respondents recorded during fall of 2020, same with the Beck Depression Inventory. This test was also scored similarly to the BDI. If you scored between 5 and 9, you got a 1 for minimal anxiety. And then so 0 to 4 was indicated no anxiety, but nobody had that. 10 to 14 indicated a 2 for moderate anxiety. 15 to 21 indicated that you had severe anxiety during this time. Here's the graph again that was provided. You can see the percentages associated here. The main trend on this graph is actually the opposite as the BDI test. Most student athletes identified within this moderate to severe anxiety range. You got 35 to 37% of these student athletes who were really struggling with intense anxiety, which I think is important. Like the Beck Depression Inventory was kind of the opposite. It was like mild to minimal depression, but you can see here that these student athletes' anxiety is kind of the main mental health problem. So now the NCAA provided some free response questions at the end of these tests. Again, they did also try to do the athlete identity measurement scale, but it was skewed and unusable. So then they were leaning more on these free response questions, and they analyzed these a little bit closer. So these questions allowed student athletes to reflect on their own mental health during COVID-19 and kind of before and after as well. They returned to campus. The researchers noticed 3 themes while they were interviewing these athletes or checking out their responses to these questions. They noticed worsening mental health, pandemic anxiety, but then positive experiences once the student athletes returned to campus. So that was a good note. I took some direct quotes right from the study. These are quotes from student athletes in this study. One of them said, "This was the hardest time of their entire life, and their mental health has never been worse and continues to get worse." Another student athlete says that they're really hoping school stays online. It's been much easier to accommodate for practices, saves a lot of time. And then they expressed that they were worried that they might catch COVID from class, and then they'll give it to another athlete, which is valid. Another one says it's difficult to not play in games, but since it's nice to be back together with my team, it's hard to get through months or weeks without being able to see anyone besides my teammates. And then the 4th student indicated being able to hang out with other athletes and make friends was really important for them mentally. Okay, so overall, this study, in my opinion, did an excellent job of trying to analyze holistic health in a way that was quantitative. There were some things missing for sure. The biggest thing that I noticed, not all the student athletes answered all of the questions that were provided to them. So their data just wasn't usable at all. This created kind of an incomplete student evaluation. So you're just missing gaps of data that could have been used but wasn't. So that's a limitation for sure. There was also an unequal proportion of female to male student athletes. There was disproportionately more female student athletes, 116 of them to be exact, and only 39 men. Um, it made me wonder, this might have been why the women recorded having higher levels of anxiety and depression. I thought further along on that and maybe wondered, well, perhaps the men weren't as comfortable admitting that they were struggling, but the study didn't mention that. So I was only speculating. Another limitation in the study did own up to this themselves in their own discussion. 75% of the participants identified as white. So there was some extreme lack of racial diversity in the study. If you don't have an accurate sample size in your study, you're not going to get accurate results that indicate real life population reality. So that was definitely a limitation of the study as well. You're going to miss out on lots of people that may have had a different experience based on their own cultural upbringing. Furthermore, the Ames questionnaire was skewed and unusable. So they couldn't even look back on their own tests that they selected for these athletes. So then they had to lean more on other tests to make up for the fact that one of them was unusable data. So they had to look at the Beck Depression Inventory, the Generalized Anxiety 7-item test, and the free response questions, as well as just, looking at how the student athletes self-report their own holistic health. So there's some limitations to that as well, because they could have exaggerated or, undermined the severity of their mental health in that moment. Which brings me to my next point. Studying human psychology is difficult. From studying other subjects, it's difficult to quantify things that aren't tangible, such as mental health problems. I think this study did a good job in terms of trying to quantify, like they took the Beck Depression Inventory and the GAD-7 and created like, okay, if you scored between these numbers and these numbers, this is mild depression, and these numbers mean moderate or severe depression. That's a good way to quantify something that's intangible, like depression and anxiety. But I think the study would have been even more effective if they had had more ways to quantify something like mental health or levels of severity of depression and anxiety. So other than that, that's about it. The study was a really good first building point. And I think this would be a really nice pilot study to build off of going forward and to see how student athletes respond to this going forward. That's about it. Thanks for listening to my critique.